I see the YouTube button is there. Excellent. And we're live. Thanks everybody for joining us for the City of Courtenay's May 17th council meeting. I'd just like to respectfully acknowledge that the land in which we're gathering and zooming on is the unceded traditional territory of the Comox First Nation. And that due to COVID-19 pandemic, in accordance with Ministerial Order M192/2020 and the class order, mass gatherings, council meetings will be conducted virtually and live streamed on the City of Courtenay's YouTube channel. I also want to just take a moment just to recognize a member of our community. Mike Butler passed away recently. He was a big person in the arts community and with the telethon, and he'll be really missed, but just a pillar of the community. And with that, we'll move into our adoption of the May 3rd regular council meeting minutes.
Move adoption.
Second.
Excellent. Any errors or omissions? Seeing none. Anybody opposed to adoption? Seeing none. Those are unanimously received. And next we can go into delegations. And if somebody would like to move the delegation.
Move receipt.
Second that.
Excellent. Thank you, Councillor McCollum and Councillor Theos. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Kathy Peters for the BC Anti-Human Trafficking Educator. Thanks so much for joining us today, Kathy.
Thank you very much, Your Worship. Human sex trafficking and sexual exploitation for the purpose of prostitution is the fastest growing crime in the world, and it is here in BC. So what is human trafficking? It's recruiting, transporting, transferring, receiving, holding, concealing, harboring, or exercising control over a person for the purpose of exploiting them. The key word is exploitation. This is modern day slavery. Here are some stats. 13 years old is the average age of recruitment into the sex industry, much younger for Indigenous girls. In the Lower Mainland, the target age is now 10, 11, and 12 years of age. COVID has made this much worse. Traffickers are very organized and sophisticated. 54% are Indigenous. They are severely overrepresented in the sex industry. This is the worst case of systemic racism in the country. I shared this with the BC Indigenous chiefs and Federal Minister of Justice, David Lametti, a couple of months ago. At the very least, Indigenous women and girls want forensic nurses and rape kits. 82% involved in prostitution had childhood sexual abuse or incest, which is preparation for prostitution later on. 72% live with complex PTSD. It is the worst form of trauma a human being can experience. 95% in prostitution want to leave. It is not a choice. It is not a job. It certainly is not work. 86% have housing needs, so homelessness makes them vulnerable. 82% need drug rehabilitation because drugs and the sex industry go together. 84%, and I just got this stat, of prostituted persons are pimped or trafficked. So it's a very small number that are doing it out of their own will or agency. So I've been raising awareness about sexual exploitation and specifically child sexual exploitation and trafficking to every city council, MLA, MP, and police agency in BC since the Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act, PSEPA, became federal law in 2014. So I raise awareness about this law so the police would enforce it, so the public would understand it and be able to report it. So the law has three parts. Number one, it targets the demand by targeting the buyer of sex. The predator, trafficker, pimp, facilitator, John, buyer of sex are criminalized. Number two, recognizes the seller of sex as a victim, usually female, and is not criminalized. Number three, exit strategies are supposed to be in place to assist the victim out of the sex trade. So this law focuses on the source of the harm, the buyers of sex and the profiteers. The clear statement from Parliament was that girls and women in Canada are not for sale. So this is the RCMP poster, that they are full human beings with dignity and human rights. Vancouver and Toronto are global sex tourism hotspots. Canada is known as a child sex tourism destination, and the public have no idea. And where did I get that from? That's from the Trafficking in Persons Report 2020 from the US State Department. And here's the book that covers that as well. Sex Industry Slavery, Protecting Canada's Youth. My website, Council has received my handouts. Those handouts are a good start to address human sex trafficking, especially the one sheet that I gave you on preventing child sex trafficking. That's very useful. My website also has useful information right here. The global sex trade is moving very fast. It is targeting our children because children is where the money is, fueled by the internet where most of the luring is taking place. So contributing factors to a rapidly growing sex industry is globalization, unregulated technology, no surprise, limited law enforcement, and very little prevention education. So that's the piece I do. Canada has a new national human trafficking hotline number, and I did send you the wallet card for that with help and resources. Provincially, we have OCTIP and Victim Link. They have helplines as well. Pornography is fueling the sex industry and creating the market for commercially paid sex. Men and boys are the buyers of sex and are the key to end exploitation. So VPD gave me this really great line. Our men and boys must understand there's a sacred part of the woman they have no right to. So what can you do in Courtney? Simple strategy. You want to reduce the demand by targeting complicit businesses, and you want to diminish the supply by education and public awareness. So train your business licensing managers what to look for when granting business licenses. This is a very effective way to give the message to the sex industry it is not welcome in your delightful, charming community. For example, number 1 is unregistered massage and body rub parlors. Number 2 is snail spas, holistic health centers, day spas, modeling agencies, tattoo parlors, escort services, cheap bars and hotels, men's clubs, Airbnb, VRBO, casinos, strip clubs, organized crime clubhouses, truck stops, homeless camps and tent cities, work camps can all be typical covers for sex trafficking and exploitation. If you have any crime clubhouses, use land use bylaws to remove them. They did that in Manitoba. Regarding hotels and motels in Ontario, in an effort to curb trafficking, they mandate the registration of every guest who's physically in the room. The sex industry is targeting our youth, children, and the vulnerable in every BC community. Schools are the recruiting grounds for gangs and sex trafficking. A critical deterrent are the school liaison officer programs in schools. The officers prevent crime and protect the vulnerable. Any anti-police narrative is going to harm our communities. They're the only people trained to protect us. BC is getting further and further behind every province in Canada in both enforcing the federal law and raising awareness with prevention education. Public awareness in BC is completely lacking. That is why I sent information packages to all 190 city councils and regional districts in BC to warn you all of this rapidly growing crime. The first question I always get asked is, where are your stats and data from? I just got this very thick from Stats Canada 2019. The numbers are low, but the trend is straight up. That's more the point. The other places I get my data from is from Federal Public Safety, Stats Canada, RCMP, National Human Trafficking Coordination Center, the National Human Trafficking Hotline number. Provincially, and I already mentioned OCTIP and Victim Link. Unfortunately, I don't see much of them anymore. I went to a lot of their courses. They were fantastic, and there's just not much on them anymore. I don't see their posters or anything out there. The best in the country is Joy Smith, and she has the Joy Smith Foundation. She is the member of parliament that introduced our 3 laws on human trafficking. Our son was her communications director, and I volunteered with her for many years. The best in the world is Valiant Richie, and you can Google his name. And he's now being hired at OSCE in Europe, and he's responsible for 57 countries and 1 billion people to stop human trafficking. And I have spoken with him, and they both just presented at the very first Canadian summit on sexual exploitation, which was just last week and was absolutely exceptional. So, I mean, Canada's very behind on this, but I'm doing what I can anyways for BC. So I do have 3 asks. Could I present to any stakeholders in your community? Number 2, could you please alert the Premier and Solicitor General that this crime is a priority in BC, and we need funding for provincial law enforcement and a provincial awareness campaign. We also need an interagency human sex trafficking task force similar to what we have for drugs and gangs. That's what they have in Alberta, Manitoba, Ontario, and Nova Scotia. And finally, could you write me a letter of support? I am meeting with Mike Farnworth tomorrow with quite an interesting panel. Thank you very much.
You've done this speech before, I'm thinking. Your timing was impeccable, and I love your slides that you had, which are very old school, but you didn't have to worry about sharing screens or any of those techie things. But honestly, I just really want to thank you. I know you've presented to our council in the past, and we've chatted in the past, but I know some of our councillors may not have talked to you at this point. So I'm going to open it up to questions. And first we have Councillor McCollum.
Thanks, and thanks for the presentation, Kathy. I heard you last week present at the regional district, and your presentation certainly had me thinking hard about this issue. And I've spent some time trying to get a better understanding of what the issue is. And admittedly, it's not a type of crime in Canada that I've really done much reading about. So I would say that your presentation is quite effective in raising awareness. My first question for you is whether or not you have any statistics related to Vancouver Island. When you presented last week, you mentioned Nanaimo being a port city, but it would surprise me if we're having people come in through that port. It's mostly a log port, I think. And I'm wondering if you have any comments about what the situation is like on a more regional level.
Okay. Thank you for that question. I just want to say Vancouver, I think I've done more presentations on Vancouver Island. I think I've presented to almost every council and regional district on Vancouver Island. So I think there's something in Vancouver Island that gets it as a big problem. You have entrenched very powerful gangs, and they're not dangerous. They're ultra dangerous. You don't want any young people to get into gangs. And certainly the sex industry is deadly. And I just want to assure you, you have a big problem in Courtenay. You have a big problem in your whole region, because I get the emails, I get the phone calls. People won't report to police. There's this anti-police narrative that's developing. And so people are saying, well, they won't listen to me. They won't believe me. If they're being pimped out, they're not going to call. But I'm just getting swamped. And I have been working on this, just so you all know, for 40 years. I used to be an inner city high school teacher. Port City, Nanaimo, Victoria, Vancouver have got a huge, huge problem with this. We have a gang war, if you're watching the news, in the Lower Mainland. And I just finished presenting to Coquitlam. They're beside themselves. So the strategies I gave you actually really work. And you can give the sign, and I know the previous mayor, he understood that. But if you, for example, with your business licensing, really address that, you will say to the sex industry, you're not welcome here. The recruiting is happening in all of your schools, your middle schools. And I'm sorry, I don't mean to frighten you, but it's happening in your elementary schools as well. COVID has made this really bad. And it's because our children are spending too much time on the screens, and the luring is happening on Snapchat, Instagram, Facebook, video games, Pinterest, you name it. The sex traffickies really, really know what they're doing. And this is why I'm just reaching out and trying to warn you all. Now, I meet with Mike Farnworth tomorrow. I'm finding the provincial government, it's been very difficult for me to get to them. And my MLA is NDP, and I'm just not getting to them. I find there's a passive stance on this crime. And I want you all to know we had a human trafficking action plan It expired in 2016. That is not good. So the word on the street to all the sex buyers and sex traffickers, BC in this whole country is where to come. So it's bad.
I don't disagree. I'm not sure that you totally answered my question about the island thing, but I appreciate the point that it is a serious concern here as well as the Lower Mainland. My other question for you is that in the last week, I've reached out to the former executive director of the Peer Society in Victoria, which provides outreach and harm reduction to sex workers in Victoria. And she suggested that there's not a lot of people that are working with, sex workers or people that are trying to get out of the sex trade that are advocating for the same approach that you are in terms of enforcement. And I'm wondering if you've spent much time reaching out to organizations that are dealing with this group and if there's some commonality there, because it seems very disjointed what, and this person has written a PhD on the sex trade, and she's a faculty member at UVic now. So I would certainly consider her an expert. And I'm wondering if, I mean, you flashed some resources there, but whether or not there is a lot of peer-reviewed literature on whether or not the sex trade is effectively reduced with this approach of funding the police, or if the resources are better spent supporting these societies like a Women's Transition Society or these harm reduction strategies. Wondering if you want to comment on that.
Okay. Your question is fabulous. And I'm sorry if I didn't answer the last question. The numbers, we don't have the numbers is my point. We don't keep stats and data in Canada. It's expensive, so we don't. So I don't have the numbers specifically for Vancouver Island. So back to everything that you're saying. In terms of Peer Society, Pace Society, Wish, there's a whole list of them. They are all pro-sex industry. So they do take quite a different tact from what I take. I don't want the sex industry to flourish and grow. So I am counter the direction that they would go. In terms of working with sex workers to help them get out, there are some exceptional agencies, but not enough. Absolutely not enough. The best in North America, surprisingly, is in Vancouver, and it's called Deborah's Gate. And the police agencies all work very closely with Deborah's Gate. Their success rate is very high. They are with the Salvation Army. They are considered one of the best 24/7 wraparound programs in all of North America. And I think the other two are down in the States somewhere. So Deborah's Gate is certainly cutting edge on that. They're very good, but again, we just don't have enough to help those that want to get out. It's true, we just don't have enough, and certainly we need funding there. In terms of the research that you're mentioning, the research that is out there, and the sex industry right now is putting in a court challenge to challenge that law that I went over. The research has a definite issue bias, and their geographic scope has tended to be only Victoria and Vancouver. It's not geographic for all of Canada at all. And they deal with, they use the term sex work. Sex work is actually not a legal term. The legal term is prostitution. That has a legal definition in a court of law. Sex work implies it's adults only, there's no trafficking, it's consensual, but that is a very tiny percentage. And I just gave you the stat that I just found out, that is 84% that are in prostitution are pimped out and trafficked. And I got that from Dr. Melissa Farley. I can give you the best place to go is Prostitution Research Education out of San Francisco. Dr. Melissa Farley, and I held up one of her books, is probably the global expert on that. But I also mentioned Valiant Richie. He is the global expert in the whole world. And at the summit, he just very clearly said, if you don't deal with the demand, if you don't have a deterrent for the sex buyer, this thing is just going to continue to explode. We have signed on as a country to the Palermo Protocol. I don't know if you've heard of that. That's under the United Nations. And that describes what human trafficking is and what we're supposed to do as countries. Canada has signed on to it. And I think it's Article 9, Section 6 says we have a responsibility to disrupt the demand. So the point is to go after the sex buyer and tell them not to buy sex. If you don't do that, combined with education, you will not stop human sex trafficking. And it is taking off. I think we're talking 20 to 40 million people globally that are involved in sex trafficking.
Thanks for all that information.
Thanks, Councillor McCollum. Councillor Morin.
Great, thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Kathy. But it's my second time for your presentation as well, which can be helpful because then you have time to absorb the information and reflect on it. Just going back to some of the strategies or actions that you suggest. Interestingly, in my other life, I've worked with girls and women quite a bit, and somewhat around this issue in terms of sexual victimization. And we did have a committee here locally called CASey, which was Community Action Against Youth Exploitation, and we did a lot of awareness and education campaigns. And also one of the things that we did was try to connect with businesses around exactly what you were talking about, which is what I see just, I mean, not going as far as the business license issue, but really having awareness around not turning a blind eye. If you see, 6 guys and a young woman go into your hotel room, maybe you need to investigate that a little further, etc. I certainly worked with girls who were exploited, not necessarily taken into the sex trafficking. So I guess I wondered, my question is around, in some of the local governments where some of these policies have been put into place, do you have some information on sort of concrete outcomes, whether there were, sex trafficking rings unveiled or anything like that? And I guess just before you answer that, I would just say that I agree to a point that enforcement is a necessary piece, but I also believe that building resiliency in young people and working with boys and young men is really important, as well as many girls and women who are exploited in this way have struggle with mental health and substance use issues and homelessness, which is often there's trades that happen because of lack of housing and other things. And I think that the complexities of the issue speak to a complex response, which involves all of those prevention type services as well. I don't think that we'll be able to enforce our way out of this kind of problem, but I do appreciate the ideas you've offered, and I'll let you answer that question. Thank you.
Okay, you covered a lot of ground there. Port Coquitlam had Robert Picton. What can I say? I mean, they were the first city council to ask me to come and present. Actually, it's Coquitlam, Port Moody, Port Coquitlam. I mean, what happened with Picton just threw them. And of course, I don't know if you've read their book. I got this on BC Ferries, actually, describing the Picton situation. And we are headed for 1,000 more Robert Pictons. That's where we're headed. And law enforcement has warned me of that. So again, that explains my advocacy. We cannot enforce our way out of this. I totally get that. That's why enforcement, so you have a deterrent along with prevention education. And I am a prevention educator. Absolutely, I'm totally with you. Again, my concern is that as a province, there's this passive stance and we're just not doing, like Alberta's 20 years ahead of us. We have a premier that's made it a priority, has a task force and has a strategy. We don't have any of those things in place. So again, the message to the sex industry is come to BC and set up shop. And I love Courtenay. I've got relatives that lived in Courtenay. I mean, it's absolutely, all of Vancouver is charming and delightful. I mean, I think of Tofino. Listen, we have Whistler here. The sex trade is just exploding. So there's a nasty criminal underbelly developing in every single community in British Columbia. That's the piece I want you to understand. I work closely with the Indigenous women and girls. I'm the keynote speaker at their Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls gatherings because they are losing their girls. They won't report to the police. They're afraid to, generational trauma and all those things. And so I'm just pleading with them, okay, here's some steps that you can do. And that's why they've asked me for the forensic nurses and rape kits at the very least. So when I say it's bad, it's our Indigenous women and girls that are really being targeted aggressively. And during COVID, you've probably all heard of sexting. So these young girls are being encouraged to do sexting, and then they get money and they get gifts and expensive things. And then they get told to come down to Surrey or Vancouver or Victoria. So that's kind of how it's working. But it's also our new migrants, our LGBTQ, our disabled, any girl under 14, some boys are being targeted aggressively, and we are not countering it. So that's what I'm just trying to present where I can. And I believe mayors and city councils are the first place to start. You know what your community looks like. You know what is going on in your community. And again, I want to stress, the sex industry wants youth, children, and the vulnerable. That is who they're going after.
Okay, thanks for that. Maybe for future presentations, it would be helpful to see those concrete examples of where the policies were changed and what came out of it, but I'll let Will go ahead. Thanks.
Thanks, Councillor Morin. Councillor Cole-Hamilton.
Yeah, thanks, Kathy. And I also saw your presentation last week at the Regional District, and a good chance to reflect on that and then to hear you this evening. One of the things that did strike me last week was your focus on the police as a kind of as an indispensable element in resolving this. You said they're the only people trained to protect women and girls in this situation. And I guess I was curious because a couple times during your presentation, you mentioned that the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls sessions, you found that people were uncomfortable with contacting the police. And you also mentioned that you were getting calls and emails yourself which were about situations occurring, say, on Vancouver Island, because people were uncomfortable calling the police. And I thought those two statements, they really rang true to me. And it made me wonder whether in future presentations, I think it can come across that you see the police and enforcement as the only way forward. And having heard your answers, I can see that you have a more nuanced perspective than that. But I think that to be saying that the police are this indispensable element and then talking about people's concerns in contacting them, I was wondering if that might be a way of perhaps making your message more clear and perhaps more nuanced than it might initially come across as. Does that make sense at all?
No, I love the feedback. Please understand, like Coquitlam gave me 5 minutes today. I get 10 minutes from you, and you've been very gracious in asking me the questions. I mean, I do write all these questions down, and I do certainly want to get back to you. In terms of the police, the good news is I work really closely with law enforcement. I give them all of this feedback. So for example, I work really closely with the Counter Exploitation Unit in Vancouver. They are probably one of the best exploitation units in all of Western Canada. I mean, they've got about 11 or 12 officers. They're extremely highly trained, and we really collaborate and work closely together. And I've a lot of young people. I helped with a couple of traffic situations this past summer, and again, worked with VPD, and they were absolutely exceptional. And the good news is that the women involved, got out of the sex industry, and they're safe and they're doing well, they're thriving. In terms of the Indigenous, again, I'm working closely with them. And we do have an Indigenous police now. The RCMP has some exceptional Indigenous police officers. They are getting more and more training, and I can pick up the phone anytime, and I phone them regularly. So it's all sort of a work in progress. I mean, at this point, BC generally, the public don't even know this is a problem. So we've got that problem. In Alberta, it's kind of fun that the top country singer is Paul Brandt, and he talks about it, sings about it. So everybody in Alberta gets this. Everybody in Manitoba gets this, because Joy Smith, the expert in Canada, is from Manitoba. But what my biggest problem here presenting in BC, and I had a counselor the other night collapse, weeping and crying, because she was so traumatized with this information. We don't even have the information that this is a problem in BC. So that's my biggest problem, quite frankly. But in terms of police, I want to let you know, I work very, very closely with them. I find that the police, I don't know how much I should be saying, but I certainly find at headquarters, RCMP headquarters in Green Timbers is who I work with, the Assistant Commissioner, Dwayne McDonald. He's fantastic, and I keep giving him the information. Again, it's all a work in progress. We can all learn from this, but it's law enforcement that have the ability to make charges, to make arrests, to, you know, search warrants, all those kinds of things. I think that's what I'm trying to explain. I did a deeper dive for the city of Langley because they said exactly what you were saying. They were concerned. And they gave me an hour and a half, and then they invited their school board and the RCMP, and we really unpacked it. The good thing about the mayor for the city of Langley is Val Vandenbroek. I don't know if you know her, but she is on UBCM Public Safety Committee and the FCM Public Safety Committee. I just presented to Coquitlam, and Charlie Hodge is on the UBCM Public Safety Committee. So the good news is we're all kind of starting to work together. We're not silos. Silos have been a problem. That's why Robert Pickton got away. We all need to collaborate and work together, I think is my point.
Excellent. Councilor Hamilton, you're nodding, so I think you were answered. So,
Thank you.
and yeah, and I guess, you know, one of the things that you mentioned just now was working with the school districts, because I think that's been another really big issue, is actually getting the information into schools. And I've attended a few workshops here in the Comox Valley, and was kind of shocked actually that the word consent wasn't taught in school. And I mean, and that, you know, when you look at that type of I don't want to say it's a mentality, but I think it does kind of go to your point that it's a bit out of sight, out of mind, you know, not necessarily a lot of attention is being put to this, and therefore it allows things to go a bit unchecked, at least more so than they would if they were, you know, if it was properly educated in the schools and through our communities. So, but with that, I don't think there's any further questions. But I do want to really appreciate you coming and talking again. And it sounds like you're making the rounds around town. So I'm sure many people are going to be seeing you, and you'll be back here again, I'm sure, as well. So with that, thanks very much for your presentation today.
Thank you very much, Your Worship. It was just a privilege.
All right, thanks very much. And one of the challenges that we have is we tend not to make motions on the same day as people give delegations. So, but I'll leave that up to council. But you have yourself a great night. Bye, Kathy. All those in favor of receipt? Everybody, excellent. Sorry, I should have said who's opposed. That would have been easier, but that was unanimous. So thanks very much for that. And she did have a few asks, but if anybody has anything that they want to do, we can put it under new business later on in the meeting. And we'll move on to the zoning bylaw amendment 3025.
Yes.
Oh, you've muted yourself. Sorry, Mel. Councillor McCollum.
Sorry. Spacebar isn't working on the button. Okay, let's try that again. I'll move that based on today's staff report entitled Zoning Amendment Bylaw number 3025, Urban Agriculture Zoning Regulations, Council approve option 1 and completes the following steps. That Council proceed to first and second reading of Zoning Bylaw Amendment 3025 to establish urban agriculture zoning regulations. The Council proceed to first and second reading of Zoning Bylaw Amendment 3038 to establish urban agriculture raising of hens zoning regulations. That Council direct staff to schedule and advertise a statutory public hearing with respect to the above referenced bylaws, and that bylaw number 3034 to amend the animal control bylaw number 1897 1996 to allow honeybees to be kept outdoors throughout the city, to first, second, and third reading, and that bylaw 39 to amend the Animal Control Bylaw number 1897/1996 to allow hens to be kept outdoors throughout the city. Proceed to first, second, and third reading.
Second that.
Excellent. Thanks, Councillor McCollum. That was a lot to say. It's much appreciated. And with that, I'll pass it over to staff, CAO Jeff Garbage.
Thank you, Your Worship, through to Council. Mr. Fitzgerald's here to give some respond to questions. We have a fairly comprehensive staff report that responds to your direction, starting on page 29 of the agenda. So if there's questions, I think just for this, for recognizing the specific direction from Council, Mr. Fitzgerald's here for questions, if that's your pleasure.
All right. Did any councillors have any questions? Councillor Hilling.
Thank you, Mary. I appreciate our CAO perhaps attempting to streamline things. From my perspective, it would be helpful to hear from Mr. Fitzgerald the highlights of the rationale behind the specific resolutions, and that way the general public who may be watching now or later will be better informed as to the thinking behind the resolution that's presented tonight. Thanks.
Thanks, Mr. Fitzgerald.
Yeah, thank you through CAO to Mayor and Council. This report concerns bylaw amendments to implement urban agriculture across the city. The bylaw first introduces urban agriculture as a permitted use on all lots when it's accessory to a single family or a single detached dwelling. It introduces a series of regulations for the three components of urban agriculture, being produce sales stands, beekeeping, and the raising of hens, all designed to minimize the impact on surrounding properties, and all generally aligned with what the CBRD and Cumberland have been doing in permitting these uses. As introduced, 4 bylaw amendments are proposed. 2 are amendments to the zoning bylaw and 2 are amendments to the animal control bylaw. And the reason we've broken it up like this is should council wish to proceed with urban agriculture generally, but maybe concerns with urban agriculture raising of hens, then one bylaw could proceed without the other. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Excellent. And first we have Councillor McCollum.
Thanks, Mayor, and thanks for the report, Matt. I just had a question about whether or not there would be a minimum lot size for the raising of hens. I know that we now have a new residential zoning that allows for a pretty small lot, and I'm wondering if a lot that small would be considered appropriate for the raising of up to 6 hens, or if that has been considered okay in this circumstance.
Yeah, thanks for the question through CAO to Mayor and Council. We haven't specified a minimum lot size for the raising of hens. It's consistent with what the other 2 jurisdictions are doing. It's certainly something we could consider, perhaps based on the feedback that we receive at the public hearing.
And just off the top of your head, I'm not sure if you can do the mental math, but if it needs to be set back away from the fence, are those lots even large enough to have a coop in the middle? Or I can't remember how small they can go, but it may be impossible with the setbacks in any case. I'm not sure.
Thanks for the question. So with regards to raising of hens, would be the same setbacks as an accessory building or a normal accessory building. And that varies based on the different zones across the city, with the exception that the coop could only be located in the rear yard, whereas accessory buildings generally may be located in side yards. So it should be possible to locate on most lots, although there may be circumstances where it becomes quite tight.
Thanks, Councillor McCollum. And next we have Councillor Frisch.
Thanks, Mayor, and thanks for the report. Oh, am I still muted? Nope. I had a question.
I had a question about just engagement on this. I know it looks like it'll be going to a public hearing if this passes at some point. And will there be something on our website explain people how to give feedback and all that? Will there be some sort of fancy point and click option for people to find out more about this bylaw?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Based on council's previous direction, we have proceeded to public hearing without any additional public consultation events. So I guess in terms of notification, it would be the statutory requirements for an overall bylaw amendment. So it'd be newspaper postings, and those would direct residents to our website where they could find all the information on the proposed bylaws, and certainly contact staff if they have any additional questions.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thanks, Councillor Fish and Councillor Moore.
Great, thank you, Mayor. Regarding the public hearing, I'm assuming all of the bylaws will be, the public will be able to respond to all of the bylaws at the same public hearing, or will they be broken up, all be at the same evening? But how will you divide up kind of the feedback on, I guess what I'm wondering is, if people go to the public hearing, will they be able to speak on all of the bylaws at once, or will they be separated out?
And I see Mr. Garbett wanted to jump in.
Just following up through the mayor to Councillor Morin, based on the discussion we had, we purposely separated the two items so that people would weigh in separately on the matter. They are separate bylaws for that purpose. And I believe the intention, or if I was reading between the lines, what council was saying is that if there was negative feedback on one component, we didn't necessarily want the entire bylaw to go down. So there will be information available there. And I don't, hopefully I'm not stepping out of line, but there would be no discussion of the other bylaw amendments that we're proposing to give readings at this council meeting.
Okay, thanks.
All right, and next we have Councillor Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Matt, so much for this report. I think these, I really enjoyed reading through the bylaws, and I think they're really strong and they're exactly what we're looking for in many ways. I had a couple of questions about the chicken one. One particular thing was that it said that you could store up to 3 cubic meters of manure on site, and I just kind of mentally visualizing that, and that's a substantial amount of manure. Is that based upon precedents from other jurisdictions?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Exactly, that's where we based it on, is the neighboring jurisdictions.
Okay, and I'm wondering, will there be, if the bylaw comes into effect, will there be a public education campaign or do's and don'ts, or a program to ensure that people who decide to embark on any of these beekeeping, chicken raising hens, or that they will be following best practices in terms of having it go well for them and their neighbors?
And I see Mr. Garbett's put his hand up again.
Thank you. Through the mayor to Councillor Cole-Hamilton. There's a lot of, we are not by no means at the leading edge of this. I'm very thankful that we have this direction. Following adoption, we can point people to those resources. We wouldn't be reinventing resources, but there's definitely a considerable amount of information that we can point the public to. Council's talked about food security and various things like that, and there's been a lot of great work done around. We would obviously try and find comparable or like type of materials to point people to, but we want to leverage what's been done already and try and minimize the amount of additional staff work on that.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. And I just have one tiny follow-up, which is a couple of times, or in the bylaw, it refers to odors that are obnoxious. And I think I'm wondering if perhaps noxious is the word that was being looked for there, because noxious means harmful to health, whereas obnoxious is just kind of annoying. And then or perhaps it's both that we want to be preventing. But just curious about that usage.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think it's intended to be, it could be either one. So we could we could make that change to the bylaw. Just have noxious odors, but I think obnoxious words as well.
Perhaps both injurious to health and generally annoying. I was just anyway, just wondering about that choice of words. Thanks.
All right, and that's generated some more questions. So, Councillor Frisch.
Yeah, well, Councillor Cole Hamilton makes a good point. I mean, they're very different words, and it would put a lot more onus on the person raising the hens to say obnoxious, and it's far more subjective as well. So, yeah, I'm not certain which way I would go at this point, but yeah, if someone complained and said that's an obnoxious smell, I'm not sure what the bylaw officer would do. I mean, would he go and agree or disagree? I don't know if staff have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, and I know Mr. Garbutt's got his hand up, so I'll let him jump in. And I know when I was on the sewer commission, that was something that came up on a regular basis, and they actually had people who work in a cubicle somewhere that literally sniff bags of air to grade the obnoxiousness of it, I guess. So, but Mr. Garbutt.
Thank you, Mayor Wells. Through to Councillor Frisch. Ultimately, we're using language that's been used elsewhere. Keeping some notes there, we'll respond back following the public hearing, and if we need to do that. I think ultimately you don't want to create levers where someone can, complain unnecessarily. We don't want to suggest something in there that causes a significant amount of enforcement challenges as well. So I know staff are keeping track of some of the questions here, and we'll make sure that through our engagement on this bylaw, we'll do a little bit more research and we can report back on the appropriate language for our own context for sure. We don't have some of our bylaws that we have to enforce don't involve sniffers. Those are some future activities that we could do. Sniffer, I think, is actually the technical term for some of the different types of odor issues that happen in larger jurisdictions. So I appreciate the question. We want to make sure that we have something that's reasonable, but also doesn't have unintended enforcement consequences, both from neighbors and or the people that are utilizing the having hens. So thanks.
Thanks for that. It makes sense, and maybe it is something that gets refined moving forward. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Councillor Frisch. And next we've got Councillor Moore.
Great, thank you, Mayor. So it sounds like, depending on what happens at a public hearing, if we decide to go that past this tonight, that there could be a kind of a mandatory component though for education. I'm just because that was part of the discussion at one point. There are organizations that are really knowledgeable in this, who are willing to provide a a couple hour Zoom workshop or whatever it is. Could that be a component of this as well?
If I can, through the mayor to Councillor Morin, we don't need specific direction on that. We will provide information if the bylaws are adopted, and reach out to those organizations that do that. My point previously, though, is this is something that we would look to other parties to do on our behalf, and try and get the message out in as effective and quick as we can.
Great, thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Councillor Morin. And Councillor Cole Hamilton.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. And just circling back to the obnoxious, I want to say I just appreciate staff looking into that and perhaps providing just a very brief report back on which word was chosen and why, because they do have impose different standards, and it would be just useful to know that. So thanks so much for being attentive to that. Look forward to hearing an update.
Excellent. Thanks, Councillor Cole Hamilton. And Councillor Hillian.
Thank you, Mayor. I just want to keep this in perspective. I'm happy to support this going to public hearing. I'm intrigued to hear what people in the community think, and to see if that is representative of the sort of change that's taken place in the 11 years since Courtney asked its residents about this before. My recollection from the work that was done on that occasion is that it wouldn't be expected that a lot of people would actually keep chickens in their backyards. I know that there's many who will, but the idea that all of a sudden we're going to have hen houses in every other lot, I think we need to keep it in perspective. It's a lot of work. If somebody has 6 hens, they're probably going to produce enough eggs that, given that they won't be able to sell them, they'll want to share them with their neighbors. And I'll certainly be looking for some of my neighbors who I know want to do this to see if they'd like to share their eggs. I had another neighbor just the other day who said, are either of you allergic to bees? Because she's looking forward to potentially beekeeping. So I think there will be a number of people who will bring this forward. And as with anything, there will probably be some people who won't do it as well as others. My primary concern is what the implications will be for our bylaw enforcement. I note the report indicates an expectation that that will be increased, and that will be an implication for the city that we'll have to be aware of and monitor it as it goes forward. But I certainly think organizations such as Lush Valley and the other community organizations that support active agriculture will be there to support anyone who wants education on how best to do this, along with whatever the city can provide. So thanks very much to staff for the work on this.
Thanks, Councillor Hillian. And yeah, a big thanks to staff for putting this report together and really articulating things so that it's put together in such a way that some people may be in favor of one thing but not others. So that's great to allow sort of that ability to really get a sense of where the support is or not. So with that, I am going to poll council, starting with Councillor Cole-Hamilton.
In favor?
And Councillor Frisch.
In favor.
Councillor Hillian.
In favor.
Councillor McCollum.
In favor.
Councillor Morin.
In favor.
Councillor Theos.
Favor.
And I'm in favor as well. And yeah, we'll be talking about this a little bit more tonight, and then we'll go to public hearing. Thanks again to staff and council for that. Next on the agenda, we've got the dike replacement strategy.
Move receipt.
Oh. Second.
Thanks for seconding that. I see Councillor Cole-Hamilton, you put up your hand, but I was going to pass it over to staff to let them give a bit of a presentation, and then feel free to keep your hand up if you'd like, and you'll be first in the question and period. All right, with that, off to staff, Mr. Garbutt.
I believe Mr. Davidson's going to do a very brief introduction and turn it over to our environmental engineer.
Yes, thank you, Jeff. Through the CAO to Mayor and Council, we are happy to present the dike replacement and flood management strategy tonight. The strategy is not the final solution for flood management in Courtenay. It's merely a stepping stone and presents a roadmap to develop tools to further manage the risk of flooding. So this strategy recommends further work, which includes the development of planning tools, regulatory tools, and area-specific mitigations. Pending council approval, this further work is tentatively scheduled for 2022. And with that, I'll hand it over to our environmental engineer, Janine Tazioli.
Thanks, Chris. Through the CAO to Mayor and Council, this dike replacement and flood management strategy is a roadmap to manage the risk of flooding. So we've gathered information to understand the problem, and the recommendations define the things we need to do to manage the risk of flooding. So approval of this report means that we will move forward with the recommendations. As Chris said, includes the development of planning tools, regulatory tools, and area-specific mitigations. We will seek council approval once these mitigations are developed and are ready for adoption or implementation. So with us here tonight, we have Glenn Shurkan from Urban Systems, and I will pass it over to him to describe the findings of the study and the recommended path forward.
Thanks, Janine. Good evening, or good afternoon, I guess it's still afternoon, Mayor and Council. Thank you for having me here tonight. I'm just going to share my screen. I've got a PowerPoint presentation that will assist us.
I can see that.
Okay, I'm just going to go full screen here. Is it full screen for you folks now?
Looks great.
Great, thanks. Well, thanks again. Janine and Chris did a pretty good job of a quick summary, and I'm just going to provide a little bit more substance behind those recommendations and next steps. The dike replacement flood management strategy is one component of a much broader toolkit the city has available in terms of managing flood risk. Within plans and regulatory tools, certainly this document or strategy will be a fundamental component of that, but it also dovetails with the citywide integrated rainwater management plan, emergency programs that are already in place, and many regulatory tools such as floodplain bylaw, OCP, subdivision and development bylaw, and building bylaws, which are already in place. It's part of an ongoing process. Once regulatory tools and studies are complete, there's an ongoing process of implementing them, enforcing the regulations, continued participation in emergency programs. Important to reach the community through public education and outreach, as well as providing support information for landowners and developers, partnerships with other jurisdictions, recognizing that the city of Courtenay isn't the only one within these risk areas. Certainly, these are often expensive solutions and require funding. So reaching out to senior levels of government, and then the regular responsibilities of operating and maintaining infrastructure that's in place. In terms of protecting, there are already some dikes in place, and dikes is often used as a very generic term. Dikes can also mean flood walls, pump stations, etc. There's shoreline vegetation and armoring, as well as channel improvements to improve conveyances. Many of the tools that I introduced are already at use by the city. You participate already in the emergency program. You have an official community plan that lays out land uses. Floodplain bylaw has existed for some time. Admittedly, it's a little dated and will require some updating. Building bylaw is an important one. There are some limited dikes, particularly along the Courtenay River. In this case, they're sheet pile walls, not conventional earthen dikes, and some limited shoreline vegetation and armoring. The plan was precipitated from a series of floods that occurred in the city in this area, dating back most recently to 2009 through 2014. It builds on a number of other studies were done. So the work that's been done as part of this study is building on some prior work that was done over a series of years. It's involved new modeling, hydraulic modeling of the Courtenay River, Puntland River, and Solom River. We also tested the effectiveness of different system modifications, again, through hydraulic modeling. We've looked at the ability to identify holistic flood management options that provide high efficiency or effectiveness, and I'll speak to those that we looked at in a few slides here. There were some introductory conversations with the CDRD, the Inspector of Dikes, who's responsible for administering the Dike Maintenance Act, and BC Hydro. There was a finding, which I'll explore here in a little bit with you, that identification of area-based options and recommendations for next steps. There's a series of flood scenarios considered. The flood risk varies depending on a range of river flow, tide, and climatic conditions. We looked specifically at a recent event, 2009, which statistically was referred to as a 1 in 20 year return period. And this is just, there's two ways to speak to what that event is. In one way, it's on average an event that may occur once every 20 years, but more precisely or succinctly, it's an event that has a 5% chance of occurrence in any given year. We looked at less severe, and when I was rehearsing this, I realized that the term less severe is probably misleading, given that it's after me speaking about a 1 in 20 year event. It's greater than the 2009 event, but it's less severe than the provincial standard, which is the 1 in 200 year, which is that last one. So a 1 in 50 year event has a 2% chance of recurrence in any given year. The 1 in 200 year event, which again is mandated by the province, is a 0.5% chance. So a very rare and extreme condition. There was another number of interventions that were also looked at. We started with looking at what we call small moves, I guess, and looking at option one was very limited widening of the Courtney River between 2nd Street and 10th Street. We also looked at connection of river flow paths through Lewis Park. Again, fairly small move. Both of those were deemed completely ineffective for the overall floodplain. We then wanted to start looking at some more extreme actions. Option 3 was looking at widening the Courtney River from Lewis Park through the estuary. The widening that was tested was 60 meters of additional widening. Option 4 looked at extreme diking, just creating more barriers along both sides, or in this case on the east side of the Courtney River from Lewis Park to the estuary. We know option 5 is managed retreat, and it wasn't something that was analyzed numerically, but we just recognize it as a potential option. However, it's certainly effective, but is a very complex process. I also just wanted to give you a sense of sort of the effects, I guess, of the 3 key options which showed some form of improvement, that being extreme channel widening, which was option 3. The image that you see here represents a future year 2100, so we factor in climate change and also the extreme 1 in 200 year condition. The blue represents the area that is expected to be wet during this event. And the color or the shade of blue represents depth, the darkest blues being the deepest and the lighter blues being shallow. So I wanted to, I guess, draw 2 things to your attention. One is just the vastness of the area, and the solution of channel widening helps lessen the depth of water over the base case. However, it doesn't change the extent of water. And I wanted to, before I flip to the next slide, just kind of look at this upper area here and the general extent of flooding, in particular the colors. So up in this area, certainly still a sizable area getting wet, but generally you can see a fair bit of lighter blue colors, meaning that it's comparatively shallow. We then looked at the extreme diking condition, which establishes a dike, and this is somewhat arbitrary. There are many alignment options that could be selected, but in this scenario, the yellow line or the limit of the blue shading represents where a dike possibly could be put. You can see that it dramatically changes the area that's impacted, but you can see how in this area, the flooding has both expanded, as well as you can see a lot more darker blue colors. So unfortunately, diking provides a benefit to some, but can create an impact in other areas. Some of the key takeaways from analysis of the intervention is that channel bank naturalization and widening in itself is insufficient to prevent flooding. Partial diking cannot provide complete protection against a 1 in 200 year event. Extreme diking can provide a benefit, particularly in the lower areas, but unfortunately at the expense of some surrounding areas, particularly upstream. It's also recognized that the critical design condition is a combination of both river flooding and tide, and it has some other graphics that'll clearly demonstrate that. Unfortunately, the finding is that there's no easy and singular technical viable solution to the problem. So we recommended going to an area-based approach. We divided the study area into 6 different areas. Area 1 along the Puntledge River, related here. Area 2, much smaller area referred to as the Condensed Reed Park. Area 3 is in the upper area along the Solom River. Area 4 is sort of the commercial higher density area, the Ryan Road, Old Island Highway. We have the River Way area along the Courtney River. And then finally, predominantly agricultural area in the Area 6, the Comox Road. We looked at a subset of scenarios in this case, narrowing it down from the 9 scenarios modeled in the initial study. We focused on the year 2100 again, factoring in climate change. And we looked at a mean water level large tide. So this is getting into a boundary condition or a tidal condition. We still looked at the 1 in 200 year flood flow coming down the river, but in combination with a mean tide. Then this is the extreme condition would be a 1 in 200 year flood flow down the river, but in combination with a future high or highest high water large tide. This is a very rare and extreme event. And because it's something that people can relate to, again, we use the 2009 event. And just to clarify, we do understand that there was a more recent flood, particularly 2014, which may have been even worse than the 2009 event. We continue to use the 209 event for comparative purpose because that event had previously been studied, so that data was easily available to use, whereas so far the 2014 event hasn't been compiled in a form that was easily used. Just looking at some of the impacts. So this is the best estimate that the models see for the flooding impact zone during that 2009 event or the 1 in 20 year event. And we have compared it against aerial photos, and it's a pretty good representation of the area that was actually impacted. You can see that there's fairly substantial flooded area in the upper zone, and particularly in the Ryan Road commercial area. Out of interest, I just wanted to show you a couple slides just to bring to light the significance of tide and the combination with flood flow. So this is the extent of, if tide was out and not a factor in the ability of water to move through the river system, this is the anticipated extent of flooding for that future extreme 2100 year 1 in 200 year event. So you can actually see that the ability of the rivers to move the water through the system is actually pretty good. But unfortunately, when you factor in high tide, then the flooding becomes quite extensive. And that's the real challenge and why it's so difficult to find a singular solution that solves the problem, is because of the tide. In terms of developing strategies, the province created a toolkit primer document a few years ago, and it broke down action items into 4 fundamental strategies: a protect, an accommodate, a retreat, and an avoid. And protect essentially means building barriers to protect an asset from being exposed to the water. Accommodate is you can't stop it, but you would build assets within the impact zone to be more resilient to flooding. Retreat means you actually move assets out of the hazard zone, and avoid means you don't put assets in there by preventing new development. And there's a series of regulatory tools, land use controls, structural solutions, and non-structural solutions that feed into each of those strategies. So we looked at developing what we thought were viable strategies for each of those service areas. For the Poutledge River areas, we think it's a combination of accommodate and avoid, done through planning and regulatory tools. For Condensory Park, largely accommodate, potentially some additional protection. There's a modest flood wall in the area today. Perhaps it can be expanded. The Solom River, similar to the Poutledge River, is to use mostly an accommodate and avoid through planning and regulatory tools. The Ryan Road, Old Island Highway commercial area, a combination of accommodate and avoid, potentially some retreat, and also in combination with protect. The Riverway, similarly, accommodate and avoid, potentially some retreat, and as well as some protect. And lastly, Comox Road, accommodate and avoid, retreat, and protect. Available planning and regulatories are already in place, likely needing update. There's floodplain bylaw and establishing new flood construction levels. Certainly application of your land use OCP and zoning bylaw, which can control building form and type. The building bylaw as well can be an important tool in terms of establishing design guidelines to help make future buildings more resilient, protecting liability through restrictive and protective covenants, and also the application of development permit areas. In terms of future study, as staff already indicated, this is one step of many. We feel that the next steps are to receive and review flood maps that have recently been prepared by CVRD and to review them against flood models. Develop flood risk maps, and I emphasize the word risk because today the maps that you've seen are simply hazard maps. They define the problem, but what they don't factor in is the consequence of that flooding. So the merger of the hazard with consequence will define the risk. Once that's there, is that the community would decide on what the acceptable or manageable level of risk is, and then decide on what risks can be managed sufficiently through regulation versus those that need physical intervention. And for those that where physical intervention is desired, is to further evaluate what those would be and conduct cost-benefit assessment. Some recommended supporting actions to this would be consult with First Nations and stakeholders beyond what's already been done, taking steps to update or implement new regulatory tools, general public education, and particularly developing resources to help developers and landowners, continuing with the emergency preparedness programs as a response to as a foundational approach in all areas. And then once defined is to launch into design and approval of capital projects. So I'll stop it there and open it up for questions.
All right. Well, Glenn, thanks so much for that presentation. Really appreciate it. And I know it's a very complex project, and the way you've actually broken it down by area obviously goes to show how it's not sort of a one size fits all necessarily type solution. And but I'll pass it over to Councillor Cole Hamilton.
Great, thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Glenn, for this. I found this extremely interesting reading, and I wanted to ask you a little bit about the assumptions of sea level rise. Excuse me. I noticed that it was a 1 meter increase in sea level rise, and it said in the report that came from BC Ministry of Environment's land use study in 2011. And I guess I'm wondering whether likely estimates of sea level rise have changed significantly during that time. I know that we're going to be confirming these models using the CVRD flood assessment. I was wondering if you happen to know if they were using a different standard for projected sea level rise, or whether theirs was also working with the 1 meter that's being used in this study.
Good question. This has been an area of debate, and there's still lots of theories around ultimately, will it be a meter or not? It's still the standard being applied throughout the greater region. 1 meter sea level rise within the province is still kind of the estimate that's being applied. I would be surprised. I have not seen the background of the analysis being done by the CVRD, but I would be surprised if it was anything different. The one thing that it does include as well, so there's a 1 meter sea level rise component, and then there's also a factor for storm surge and wave run up. Those are added aspects that are very site specific. So in essence, a 1 meter rise means in all locations, the whole tide cycle just rises a meter. But then we have local conditions that influence storm surge and wave actions. Those have also been factored in. I think it's certainly the prerogative of a local jurisdiction to plan for something different than the 1 meter, but the 1 meter is still the standard being applied.
Okay, thank you. I just, given the decade that's come between that 1 meter standard being set, I was curious to know if it had moved. It's encouraging to know that A, that it hasn't, and B, that these figures are still, and maps are still likely to be valid. I have a couple of other small questions, but maybe I'll come back in a second and put my hand up then. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Cole Hamilton. And next we have Councillor McCollum.
Thanks, Mayor, and thanks for the presentation again, Glenn. It was actually really helpful seeing this in addition to the report, because it actually helped cross out some of the questions I had after reading the agenda package. One of the questions I had was around option 3. It says 6 meter like extreme widening, is it, or 60 meters, sorry. Is that 60 meters in addition to the existing, or is it a 60 meter? So it's an additional 60 meter.
Additional 60 meters, yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty extreme. I guess the other question that I have around these options are and next steps is, I mean, clearly there's problems outlined with all of them, and it seems to me that if we're looking at addressing a flood event, it has to include the high tide, because it's, you know, every time we've seen flooding, it is a combination of these two factors. And from what I could read in the report, the only option that addresses both without impacting other areas is option 5. Am I reading that correctly, or are we still considering the other options that are outlined there as we move this process along?
Well, I think everybody recognizes that managed retreat is extremely difficult. It's a choice that communities have, but the logistics of it are often prevent it from happening in its entirety. At least, you know, select decisions can be made, but I think the reality is we're in a state of trying to limit future impact, but we also, so through regulation, you can ensure at least that we're not putting additional assets in harm, or at least are allowing things to be built that can be more resilient to that. But in terms of existing infrastructure, this is the tough decision that needs to be made is how do we protect existing assets? And we really need to look at, again, risk. We need to look at sort of the time horizon. So another important thing moving forward perhaps would be to look at a time series. We can do additional analysis that really looks at how risk is anticipated to change over time, in combination with understanding the demand for redevelopment. You know, an area that's expected to not redevelop at all for 50 years is quite different than an area that has high development pressure and anticipated to see a lot of change. So life cycle of infrastructure is also part. I'm probably wandering off of your initial question here, so I don't know if I've adequately answered it or whether you want to explore that a little bit more.
It was a helpful answer. I guess it kind of raised two more points for me. One, the resilience piece. You kind of answered that partly in your presentation, and that was something that I was pondering as well. And you know, how much resiliency can you build or accommodate in a building code? Like, do we have examples in BC where we have effectively created changes in a building code that could address this kind of flooding, or is that kind of a stopgap in maybe more marginal areas that aren't so directly impacted as, say, the most impacted areas in this strategy?
Yeah, no, there's definitely good examples. I think one of the things, and again, it gets into the risk assessment, is looking at the depth of flooding. Depth of flooding is a very common thing to consider in building resilience. A building, for example, getting inundated or hit by 8 inches of water is quite different than a building getting hit by 8 feet of water. And there are lots of examples. Generally, in a building getting hit by water, it's wood and drywall and other things that are more damageable. You know, you can make decisions about ensuring concrete or steel or other building materials that are more resilient to flooding. You can limit the storage and the use of materials, just like, you know, basement buildings. In this case, you wouldn't have subsurface structures, but, you know, limiting electrical systems need to be elevated above the ground. You know, you wouldn't put a pattern out transformer in the flood zone, but you'd elevate it. So there's many actions that some buildings are built on stilts. That might be a bit extreme, but there's lots of examples of creating resilient infrastructure and resilient buildings.
Great, thanks for the answer. And I did see quite a few buildings built on stilts when I went on a trip to the Danube River a couple of years ago, and it did remind me of our flooding problems and whether that's a building system that's ever used in Canada. So yeah, thanks for the answer.
Yep.
Thanks, Councillor McCollum. And next we have Councillor Frisch.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation, Glenn. I had a quick question about sea level rise, and I'm not sure if I'm on the right track here, but the 1 meter increase that's, I guess, estimated at this point and under debate, does that include the sort of the rise of the landmass of the Vancouver Island? Do they account for that? I understand it is kind of pushing up several millimeters a year.
It does not, but you're right. In some jurisdictions, in some cases, people do go to that level of refinement where they look at the movement of land. In some areas, it's rising. In other areas, it's falling. In this case, no, that has not factored in.
It might not be as consequential as the actual rise of sea level anyways.
Yeah, no, it's definitely not going to be a game changer in terms of what the outcome is.
Mm-hmm. And so on to the schedule of deliverables. I don't know if you have any thoughts on this, but stakeholder engagement is kind of scheduled to come up pretty quick. Do you have any idea what that would look like, or is that a question for our staff?
Probably start with staff on that one. I can support them if required.
Through CAO to council, thanks for your question. As far as stakeholder engagement goes, we're going to be starting on some of those bylaw options, the regulatory tools that we can implement right away, getting some stakeholder engagement around those. And you'll notice that that's actually broken up into a couple of sections, just because we'll have that stakeholder piece throughout the duration of the project, both immediately after this, as well as following additional flood risk mapping.
Okay, so we'll have some changes that we might be looking at coming to the public fairly soon, and they can comment on that or give their thoughts. I imagine the construction industry, the development industry might have a lot to say about that, and current landowners in the area. I don't know if we're getting into that sort of stuff too.
Yeah, exactly. Like when the time comes and we have those the details of those bylaws prepared, that's when we'll be going for stakeholder engagement.
Wonderful, thanks so much.
Thanks, Councillor Frisch. And next we have Councillor Cole Hamilton.
I think Jeff had his hand up there.
Yeah.
But,
Sorry, thanks, Councillor Frisch. My apologies for interrupting. I just want to say that these are at this point quite high level. When the rubber meets the road and you start to have these conversations, very focused engagement is extremely important on implications and options, and both council and the general public as well as the interested public would be engaged. So I just want to respond to the question from Councillor Frisch, and it's a very, very important process that will be unfolding following this study.
All right, thanks, Mr. Garbett. And I believe that may have answered all the questions.
No, actually.
And Councillor Hillian jumped on as well. So Councillor Hillian.
Okay.
He beat you by that much, Councillor Cole Hamilton. My apologies.
Thanks, Mayor. And thanks very much for the presentation. And just for full disclosure, Glenn, you actually presented it to us at a lunch and learn session recently. So we had a sneak preview of this. And I'll raise the same points that I raised then for public consumption. I'd just like to hear what the intent is for the potential engineered solutions that may still form part of this as we move on to develop plans. And in particular, one of the dikes that we have was not intended to be a dike, but it's actually called the Highway 17 bypass. And we've had considerable discussion over the years, and I believe are still with the Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure about the potential for engineering so that water can access the floodplain when the river does flood, and not be held back by the highway bypass. So just my first question is if you can confirm if that is still in the plans, whether through Glenn or staff, in our dialogue with the Ministry of Transportation.
I can answer that, or Chris, did you want to answer that at all, or do you want me to?
If you don't mind, thank you very much for the question, Councillor Hillian. Yes, still many discussions to be had. I won't speak to that point specifically. There's still quite a bit of risk mapping to be done before we fully understand all the implications. But going back to Jeff's point earlier, there's still quite a process ahead of us as far as engaging on specific infrastructure responses and engaging with key stakeholders. There's still quite a bit of homework and modeling and risk flood mapping to be done before we get to that point where we can make statements about specific pieces of infrastructure.
Thank you. I appreciate that, but you'll give me the grace of just assuring that some of these issues that have come up over the years are not left behind in the conversation. And the other one I want to raise, we've had presentations to this council in previous years from local stream keepers and environmental organizations advocating for innovative solutions, such as, for example, the lowering of Puntledge Road to provide access for floodwaters to access the floodplain through a breach in the dike road without damaging the existing businesses. And so I just want to go on record that's a presentation that has been made in the past, and there may be other innovative suggestions that the local community has when we move to consultation. Given the structural changes that we've made to our rivers in the past have created some of the problems that we are dealing with now. And that's why I'm really glad to see that we're not being advised to go to a further diking strategy that is being acknowledged as, in general, not very effective. So the only other comment I wanted to make, or question I wanted to raise, was anytime we talk about flooding, questions come up from the general public about why we continue to allow building along, for example, the estuary in the area of the air park. And we have an item for final adoption on the agenda later tonight of the hotel on Hunt Road. If we could get a comment from staff or our consultants, just in terms of the precautions the city's taking as those developments continue to take place. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Councillor Hillian. And Councillor Cole-Hamilton.
Excuse me, Mayor, that was a question.
Sorry, Chris.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. I'll pass it over to you, Chris.
Excellent. Thank you very much for the question, Councillor Hillian. Through CIO to Mayor and Council. The short answer is existing policy is in place as it is. And I hate to sound like a broken record, but unfortunately, we don't have enough data or analysis done to make any significant changes or inform any changes to policy yet. So while we anticipate there may be some coming in the future, depending on how the risk mapping goes, we don't have enough to base significant changes on at this point in time.
But just to clarify, it's not something that we ignore when we're considering developments in close proximity to the water.
No, that's correct, but perhaps I'll pass it over to Ian Buck to comment on this further.
Yeah, thanks very much. Just to clarify, what we do today is generally what's referred to as accommodate in the options. And that involves a study by a geotechnical engineer with every building permit that identifies what the risks are, what the flood levels are, and then the construction requirements, whether that's enhanced foundations or other dewatering mechanisms with the building. So it is taking into account the floodplain modeling that was done, I guess, the late 80s, early 90s by the provincial and federal governments. And then we did add a 0.1 meter elevation addition to those flood modeling for sea level rise. So we are taking that into consideration, and barring any changes to policy in the future, that's what we'll continue to follow.
Thanks very much. I just really appreciate that being on the record for public consumption. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Hillian, and sorry, Chris, for cutting your answer off there at the beginning. My apologies. Councillor Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you. First of all, I just wanted to follow up a tiny bit on Councillor Hillian's question. Ian, did you say that this is based upon the current, if there's the study that's required with the development permit, that would be conducted by the person applying for the permit? And do we have a standard as to what sea level rise they're using as they go about their assessment at this point for each individual building? Is it incorporating, say, the 1 meter standard, and what kind of, I'm just trying to figure out where their flood mapping is derived from.
Yeah, thanks for the question again. Just to clarify, there was mapping that was done by the provincial federal governments in the, I believe, late 80s, early 90s. Ours probably is around that 91 date. We added a number of years ago, probably 2012, 13.8 meters to that elevation. So it's previous modeling plus 0.8 to accommodate for flooding. And then under section 57 of the community charter, in any hazard area, with any building permit, the building inspector is entitled to ask for a report identifying it's safe for the intended use and under what circumstances. That is then incorporated into a covenant that goes on title. So when construction ultimately is underway, those requirements are adhered to. They are hired by the applicant. We do review them. If there's any questions, we can get third-party review, but they are held to APEG or EGBC standards as engineers.
Thank you. That was really helpful. And I did have one other question, if that's all right, Mayor.
Yep.
And this probably may go to staff. In the report, on page 48, there's some recommendations, and there's a very specific one, which number 2, which says to conduct a detailed site-specific analysis for areas 4 and it, which is the Ryan Road, Old Island Highway area, and area 5, the Riverway, and there. Those 2 areas out of the 6 are identified for detailed analysis. From looking at the recommendations we're going to be voting on today, I wasn't sure if that was captured within them. I didn't see that it probably was, and I'm wondering if that's a step that would occur after this step is completed, or whether that is included within the work we're going to be doing with the recommendations.
Chris, you want to answer?
Thank you very much for the question through CAO to Mayor and Council. I don't think we need that level of detail in the form of a motion from Council there to proceed with the work. We're still sort of refining the terms of reference for the next phase of work, and we still have some engagement to do with some key stakeholders before we nail down exact details. So we opted to leave the recommendations a little more general in that regard, just to allow some flexibility. But one of the goals of the future work will be to fast track that section, as we do understand that it's likely the area that needs the most attention.
Great, thanks, Chris. I appreciate your clarification on where that's at.
Excellent. Thanks, Councillor Cole-Hamilton, and all of council and staff for a very robust and detailed conversation on a very, again, complex topic. With that, though, we do have a motion on the floor, so I'll start polling council, starting with Councillor Cole-Hamilton.
Excuse me, point of order.
I think we're on receipt.
Mr. Mayor.
Oh,
I believe we're on receipt.
You're right. My apologies. Anybody opposed to receipt? All right. And
I'll move the recommendation, Mayor. I haven't found the page, so just give me a second.
Page 35.
Okay.
Further point of order, Mr. Mayor.
Yeah.
I note that the recommendation reads differently on page 35 versus page 40, and I'm wondering which the staff would like read into the record as the actual motion.
Because yeah, page 40 is certainly more detailed and articulated potentially. So maybe we'll just stand by for a second, Councillor Cole-Hamilton.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much for noticing that. Page 40 would be the preferred, please, and thank you.
Great, thanks. So I will move that council approve the final draft of the dike replacement and flood management strategy and direct staff to implement recommendations, including review flood maps prepared by the CVRD and verified flood models, develop a flood risk map to identify properties with an unacceptable flood risk, implement the regulatory and planning tools that will manage the impacts of flooding in all areas, and address properties identified to have an unacceptable risk by determining which structural and non-structural flood management options will be the most effective at mitigating the risk.
Second.
Excellent. And again, we've had a fairly robust conversation, so I will poll council on the actual motion, starting with Councillor Cole-Hamilton.
In favor.
And Councillor Frisch.
In favor.
Councillor Hillian.
In favor.
Councillor McCollum.
In favor.
Councillor Morin.
In favor.
And Councillor Theos.
Favor.
Excellent. I'm in favor as well, so that's unanimous. Thanks very much. And next we have, sorry, I've lost my page here. The briefing note for the capstone project.
Move receipt.
Second.
Excellent. And I'll pass over to staff. Mr. Garbett.
Through the mayor to council, Ms. Saunders will give you an update as we've had a tiny change in circumstances following the publishing of the agenda.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. Through CAO to Mayor and Council, just wanted to provide you an update. As I mentioned in the briefing note, staff are working with the artists as well as the Comox Valley Community Arts Council to find a location for the temporary mural. We were looking at the building that houses the Connect Warming Center as per Ms. Funk's request. But unfortunately, that site is no longer suitable just due to the condition of the exterior of the building. And so we learned that this morning, just wanted to provide council an update. We've informed the artists and the Comox Valley Community Arts Council, and they are looking at alternative locations. And we do know that there's a few in the works and that the artist has received support from other privately owned locations. So we're hopeful and we'll continue to work with the artists and the Arts Council to try and find a location that works for the artists. So just wanted to provide that update.
Excellent. Thanks very much. Councillor Morin.
Thank you, Mayor. Sorry, I didn't realize my camera was off. Just have a question. I guess the original plan was to paint the mural directly onto the surface. I'm just wondering if that location could work if it was painted on something separately and then mounted.
Thank you for the question. I don't have an answer. It is something that we can follow up on. Based on the environmental assessment of the building, that may not be an option, but it's something that we'll consider for sure.
The reason I say that is because it is just with the messaging, it is a great location for that particular messaging. Thanks.
Thanks, Councillor Morin. And Jeff, Mr. Corbett. Oh, you're muted.
Not muted. Thanks. Through the mayor to Councillor Morin, I recognize that was the location, the desired location. I think it may add some additional cost to the project if it was on a freestanding type of arrangement. So based on the information in the briefing note, we'll continue on potentially exploring that. We're just notifying council that it will be a bit challenging. And so given what's underway, probably the most practical solution, although it does add a little bit of time, is another location. But we certainly appreciate that direction, and we'll see what we can do in that regard.
Excellent. Thanks for that. And Councillor Frisch.
Yeah, thanks, Mayor. And I just wanted to thank staff for putting the effort into this. I realize that these things are often more complicated than we imagine them to be, and that seems to be the case here. So yeah, I appreciate the attention you've given this, and hope we can find a way forward. And
all right. All right. With that, it is just for a receipt. Anybody opposed to receipt? Seeing none, that passes. And next we'll get into reports and updates from council. We'll start. I think the only one who sort of said they had something, I believe, was it Councillor Hillian?
Well, thank you, Mayor. I just wanted to, as we discussed earlier, acknowledge that we had 3 Comox Valley businesses, Courtenay businesses, that were nominated for Small Business Awards, as I mentioned at our last council meeting. Those included Core Landscape Products and Spirits of the West Coast Art Gallery, both of which were nominated for awards for innovation. But we also had Bigfoot Donuts, who won the Premier's People's Choice Award, and very coveted, and a credit to the strong support that business has in the community. So just a shout out of congratulations to those businesses, and a recognition of the excellent commercial sector of small businesses and otherwise that we have in our community and the Comox Valley in general. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Councillor Hillian. And my apologies, Councillor Moore. And I said the only one, and then I saw his name and I put a little ticky next to it. But you actually had asked first to speak. So Councillor Moore.
Thank you, Mayor. Just to add to Councillor Hillian, just a little shout out that Bigfoot is also looking for a staff member. So, and apparently part of the perk is all you can eat, basically. So certainly wouldn't be a job that I would take on, as much as it would probably be wonderful working there. But anyway, they are looking for a staff member, so you can spread the word to folks who might need a job at a great place. Yeah, I just wanted to do a bit of a report on a short kind of online event I participated in last week, which was put on by DIG, which is Digital Innovation Group, and they're a kind of a collaborative of arts councils that are working on digital innovation on the island. And of course, our Comox Valley Arts Council takes part in that. And I just thought I'd use the opportunity to update a little bit on some of the things that are going on with Comox Valley Arts and that people may want to participate in. So the DIG group is doing a lot of work around technology, helping artists with online formats, et cetera, especially with COVID and responding to that and the challenges that it's presented for local artists. But one of the things that they're doing is they're doing an economic impact assessment of the arts sector. And just from the website, just because it states it more clearly than I could, have you ever wondered about the value artists and arts organizations contribute to our economy, to tourism, general well-being, and community? And so this study is going to really look at that. They've got some wonderful researchers who are helping with this study. So I'm quite excited to see that, because that will really provide a snapshot as to the economic benefit of the arts in our, well, on the whole island. And just on that note, the Local Arts Council is doing a survey, and you can complete the survey by going to comoxvalleyarts.com/survey 2021. And I thought it would be for any public who watch this meeting and may want to participate in that, I put that out there. And also that Comox Valley Arts has started their strategic planning, and they are going to be doing some follow-up with the some of the recommendations that came out of the Patricia Huntsman study. And I know we are going to be looking at that again in, I believe, next year, 2022. So I just wanted to provide a bit of an overview of some things that are happening in our arts community and make mention of the study and on that survey. And that's about it. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Councillor Morin, and I see Councillor Hillian.
Thanks very much, Mayor. I just want to add to your acknowledgement at the start of the meeting about the passing of Mike Butler. And for those who don't know, apart from his tremendous role in community service and drama and theater over many, many years, he was also awarded the Freedom of the City, and his picture is up on the wall at City Hall. We've really lost, as you said, a pillar of the community. And I just want to add my condolences to the family and recognition that this was a key member of our community, a lifetime resident of Vancouver Island, and a key member of our community over many years. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Councillor Hillian. And just as a, I guess, a bit of a heads up for council, when I did find out that he was fairly ill, I did reach out to him and communicated on behalf of council just how much of a benefit and better off our community is because of the work that he's done across many different things. And in fact, I met him weirdly as I think he was a volunteer for the Sandwich Water District, because he was just a guy who just did everything, you know, and really wanted to do what he could to make the community better. So thanks again, Councillor Hillian.
Thank you, Mayor.
Especially for acknowledging that. I had forgotten about the Freeman of the City, so I really appreciate you bringing that up and acknowledging it. And are there any other reports from council? I think that might be it, but before we move on, next we have resolutions of council for in camera.
I can move that, Mayor. So my agenda is just freezing for a second. Be resolved that a special in-camera meeting closed to the public will be held May 17th at the conclusion of the regular council meeting pursuant to the following subsections of the community charter: 91 sub C, labor relations or other employee relations. And I am actually recalling there's an email from Ms. Matthews saying there's an additional piece. So I perhaps don't have the correct one in front of me. So was there an additional ground of the provision of the sorry. Ms. Matthews, was there an additional provision of the charter beyond that? I'll have to look through my email. My apologies.
Yes, there was also, thank you, through the CAO to Mayor and Council, there was also section 91J, 91K, 92B of the community charter. I can send you a snip if you'd like. Do you have your email open?
Thank you very much.
Okay.
And I think our records can reflect that in the minutes.
Okay.
And email came through just after 1 o'clock today as well.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Rand.
Okay.
All right, that's been moved and seconded. Thanks, Councillor Frisch, for seconding that, and Councillor Cole-Hamilton for, well, we're all doing our best tonight, so appreciate that. And we're going in camera, so I'll poll council, starting with Councillor Cole-Hamilton.
In favor.
And Councillor Frisch.
In favor.
Councillor Hillian.
In favor.
Councillor McCollum.
In favor.
Councillor Moran. Uh-oh. I think you said in favor, and then Councillor Theos.
In favor.
Thank you.
Excellent. Everybody's in favor. I'm in favor as well. Thanks for that. And now we'll move into bylaws, unless there's anything under new business, but I don't believe anybody has anything. So for first and second reading.
Mayor, I'm happy to move that zoning amendment number 3025, 2021, the urban agricultural bylaw to amend zoning bylaw number 2500, 2007 to establish urban agricultural zoning regulations past first and second reading.
Second.
Excellent. And we've had a pretty robust conversation about this. Are there any questions or comments? And seeing none, I will poll council, starting with Councillor Cole-Hamilton.
In favor.
Councillor Frisch.
In favor.
Councillor Hillian.
In favor.
Councillor McCollum.
In favor.
Councillor Moran.
In favor.
And Councillor Theos.
I'm in favor.
And I'm in favor as well. And next we have the raising of hens.
I can move this one. I'll move that zoning amendment bylaw number 3038, 2021, raising of hens, a bylaw to amend zoning bylaw number 2500, 2007 to establish urban agriculture raising of hens zoning regulations. Proceed through first and second reading.
Second.
All right, thanks, Councillor McCollum and Councillor Frisch. Again, we've had a pretty robust conversation, so I'll poll council, starting with Councillor Cole-Hamilton.
In favor.
And Councillor Frisch.
In favor.
Councillor Hillian.
In favor.
Councillor Moran.
In favor.
Councillor McCollum, sorry.
In favor.
And Councillor Theos.
I'm in favor.
Excellent, thanks. Sorry, I was giggling there a little bit because I was like, I wonder what would happen if I just started throwing the names out randomly these days, but that confused me more than I think anybody else. So I'm in favor as well, and that's unanimous. Thanks again. And moving on to honeybees.
Mayor, I'll move that animal control bylaw amendment bylaw number 3034, 2021 honeybees, a bylaw to amend animal control bylaw number 1897, 1996 to allow honeybees to be kept outdoors throughout the city past first, second, and third reading.
Second.
Thanks very much. And I'll poll council, starting with Councillor Cole-Hamilton.
In favor.
And Councillor Frisch.
In favor.
Councillor Hillian.
In favor.
Councillor McCollum.
In favor.
Councillor Moran.
In favor.
And Councillor Theos.
I'm in favor.
And I'm in favor as well, so that passes. And next we got hens.
I can read this.
I'm happy to move animal control bylaw amendment bylaw number 3039 for hens, which is to allow hens to be kept outdoors throughout the city past first, second, and third reading.
Second.
Excellent. And I'll poll council, starting with Councillor Cole-Hamilton.
In favor.
And Councillor Frisch.
In favor.
Councillor Hillian,
In favor.
Councillor McCollum,
In favor.
Councillor Moran,
In favor.
and Councillor Theos.
Okay.
And I'm in favor as well. So that's unanimous. And last, for final adoption,
I can move this, Mayor. I'll move that a bylaw, zoning amendment bylaw number 2994, 2021 for 310 Hunt Road, a bylaw to amend zoning bylaw number 2500, 2007 to create a comprehensive development 31 zone CD31 and rezone from land use contract LUC to 31 zone CD1 to facilitate the development of a 93-unit hotel, 310 Hunt Road.
Second.
excellent. And any questions or comments before we poll council, starting with Councillor Cole Hamilton
In favor.
and Councillor Frisch,
In favor.
Councillor Hillian,
In favor.
Councillor McCollum,
In favor.
Councillor Moran,
In favor.
and Councillor Theos.
In favor.
And I'm in favor as well. Only one thing left.
Move adjournment.
Excellent. Anybody opposed? See nobody opposed. We are